Hey everybody, another video for you. Sorry for the absence, but hey, guess what? All kinds of fun things are happening, like me breaking two toes on my left foot. That was a lot of fun. Me getting a sinus infection that lasted for a week was a lot of fun. My kids being sick was a lot of fun. Lots of things that are just oh so joyous in this holiday season that I've been dealing with. I'm limping around, but I'm okay, and there's so much to discuss. Now, I'm not going to do an update for this video. I'm going to do another one, hopefully a little bit later today. Although I think the last time I said that, it took me a week, so we'll see. But um, I have a lot to say, a lot of developments, a lot of news stories coming out of Ukraine and Russia that need to be covered. But for today, briefly, I'm going to do one short video. Hopefully, it's short about, I guess, what you might call the rhetoric of the alleged anti war left on this issue of Ukraine. And I'm going to try my best to address some of the arguments. I suppose that's what they are, and hopefully to bring a little bit more clarity to what it means to actually be anti-war and what a real left anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist position on Ukraine would actually look like, because many of the people who parade themselves around and as anti-war voices are not in fact anti-war, just as many of those who parade around as anti-imperialist voices are in fact little more than mouthpieces for Russia or for NATO or whomever, right? So we need to be serious about these things. We need to be serious about what these terms mean. And to be anti war means to try to stop the war, to oppose the war in all ways, not simply to pick one side or the other. And so let's talk about what the anti war position is, what the alleged anti war position is. So many of those organizations and individuals, some of whom are prominent with prominent platforms who claim to be anti war, they claim to also speak for the true and authentic anti war left. But this is, of course, false, because there was no actual anti war sentiment from any of these people at the very beginning of this war. I did not see any of the so called prominent left wing anti war organizations protesting outside of Russian embassies in February and March of 2022. Never saw that. We have yet to see a single piece of evidence that any of these allegedly anti war organizations, allegedly on the left, are doing any kind of solidarity work with anti war voices inside of Russia, that they're doing any kind of solidarity work with anti war voices in Europe, that they're really involved in much of anything outside of building up their own brands, creating the same coalitions with the same few groups that are always working together and more or less trying to build themselves up as the voice of the anti war left in the United States, when in fact they are little more than the voice of a subsegment of the left. But we're going to talk about some of the arguments because I agree with some of them, of course, because they do they are rooted in an anti-war position, but it is selective, it is myopic, it sees only one side of the war. So let's talk about all sides here. So first and foremost, the anti-war voices, so-called anti-war voices that I'm talking about, and I've been, debating whether I should just start blasting everybody's name publicly by names of individuals, by names of organizations, or if I should just keep it more general. Perhaps keeping it general is safer in this unbelievably toxic hellscape of social media and elsewhere that we all unfortunately live inside of. But I guess, organizations that, have some presence, whether it is just on social media or whether it is on the ground, who position themselves as anti war and position themselves on the left, that outright refuse to speak plainly and honestly about what Russia has done in this war. That's who I'm talking about. Sure, there's plenty of reasons why they can be honest and forthright and open and correct about many of the things that the United States and NATO has done, about many of the dangers of this conflict. And yet, that Russia piece, for whatever reason, is just rampant with dishonesty, rampant with argumentation that is lackluster if I'm being generous, or blatantly cynical and dishonest if I'm being real. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the position that these type of individuals and organizations, many of whom I've worked with in the past, the position that they present is one whereby Russia's war, which they kind of sort of in a mealy mouthed way condemn, sort of buried down in paragraph like 36 of whatever the article might be. They may sort of kind of condemn the war, but they frame the war as defensive. And it is defensive in a number of ways. And that defensive characterization of the war that Russia voluntarily prosecuted both in 2014 and then especially in 2022, the way that they frame that as a defensive war for Russia, that then informs every aspect of the analysis. For if you believe that Russia, it was in a defensive posture and was forced to invade and conduct crimes against humanity and all of the killings and everything else, that they were forced to do so, well, then everything that follows from that is necessarily going to paint Russia as a victim. Which, of course, think about what this means. An anti war position that frames the warmongering invader as the victim. How can this be possible? How can this make any sense at all? Well, it makes sense only if one believes that the only malignant power on the planet is the United States, and more importantly, that there is only one form of global imperialism, which is the US dominated imperial system, that there can never be anything but that. In other words, anything that is in opposition to the United States and its military appendage that we call NATO, if anything that is in opposition to that is by definition not only to be supported but cannot be considered aggressive. And in fact, many are making this argument, including many luminaries on the left who are making this argument. And this gets into a lot of different areas. Do you want to call it an inter-imperialist conflict? Do you want to call it a sub-imperial neo-colonial conflict, an imperial revanchist war, whatever you want to call it? It really, at this point, I'm not even going to quibble about it, because I think that unfortunately that derails a lot of the important discussion. For me, the most important fact here is understanding that Russia invaded Ukraine twice, in 2014 and in 2022. Neither one of those is actually truly acknowledged by the so-called anti-war left. I'm going to talk about 2014 in a minute. And more to the point, the entire war is predicated and actually is based on NATO expansion, which is extremely interesting because on the one hand, it's partially correct. So I give credit to anybody saying, well, the war is about NATO expansion. I used to be a teacher. I'll give you half credit for that because it is a half truth. And in fact, the Kremlin is very good at peddling half truths, because the half truths, when put together, can create at least a nominally passable argument in favor of what Russia has done. Okay, but the point here is that in fact, they're ignoring all of the other factors. If it was just about NATO's expansion, as certain organizations are claiming, like well, I don't know. I'm still debating whether I should be naming names or not. Code Pink is a prominent example. Code Pink is an organization that I've worked with before, that I've promoted in various contexts, and I'm appalled by the position they've taken, whereby NATO expansion is all they talk about. No mention of 2014, Russia's importation of Russian fascists and neo-Nazis, the Russian imperial movement, the various so-called DPR and LPR militias, which are in fact stocked with Russian mercenaries and various other fighters who have streamed into Donetsk and Lugansk since 2014 and created the frozen conflict and created that aspect of this war. Of course, none of that is mentioned. Why would it be? It's extremely damaging to the idea that Russia's fighting a defensive war here. If in fact you see it in its totality, then you see that, well, geez, Russia's actually been fighting a war in Ukraine since 2014, and only in 2022 did they outright invade directly with their military. But I digress. Okay, so organizations that are claiming to be anti-war, that position themselves as NATO expansion is what drove this war. Oops, I guess they didn't even listen to Putin's speech, which inaugurated this war, the speech that he gave on the eve of the invasion, in which, yes, he mentioned NATO expansion, because that is part of this, of course. But what else did Putin mention in that speech? Oh, he mentioned the dastardly villain Lenin and those evil Bolsheviks three parentheses around Bolsheviks, of course, as we know. He mentioned all of that, and that the Ukraine problem was created by Lenin, created by the Bolsheviks. This is, of course, going back to the issue of Lenin's position on the right of nations to self-determination, the right of the peoples of the Tsarist realms, the Russian Empire, the right of those nations to determine their own fate. This was the idea that Lenin promoted, that the Bolsheviks promoted through, well, leading up to 1917. And then, of course, there was the period of the Civil War, but we don't have time to get into that. The point is, the reason why Putin made an explicitly anti communist, anti Lenin, anti Bolshevik speech in launching this war is because it is one of the motivations. It's not just NATO expansion, it is righting the historical wrong of the existence of Ukraine entirely. Putin and his criminal gang does not recognize Ukraine's legitimate right to exist at all in any form, or to the extent that they do recognize it, it's only Western Ukraine. Okay. Now, this aspect of the rationale behind the war is completely missing from all allegedly anti-war writing that I've seen that is advocating for immediate negotiation, for an immediate ceding of territory, negotiation that leads to the ceding of territory to the Russians. All of this is totally ignored. I wonder why that is. Maybe because it undermines the very convenient argument that it is NATO that created this war, that it is NATO that drove this war. NATO is an imperial monster, but NATO didn't invade Ukraine twice. That was Russia. Okay, now, if you want to say that NATO's cajoling and coaxing and prying of Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence, as if leftists and Marxists are supposed to recognize spheres of influence, but that's a separate issue. That this NATO, this malignant force of NATO, that this is the only reason. This is what they say. This is literally what they argue. It's, of course, complete nonsense. All right, NATO expansion is part of it. It is not the only part. There is no mention in any of their writings that I've seen, and I'm happy to be, to say, oh, no, I'm wrong because somebody sent me an article from somebody, right? But from what I can tell, there is no mention of anything related to Russia's oligarchs, their rivalries with Ukrainian oligarchs, the desire to exploit the agriculture and the industrial base, the desire to steal capital goods, machine tools, factories, to essentially, I don't know what's the word, to I guess, to make a hostile takeover of the assets of Ukrainian oligarchs by Russian oligarchs, that there was an inter oligarch conflict, both in Donetsk and Lugansk, but more broadly in Ukraine. None of that is mentioned. There is absolutely no mention of any of the underlying reasons that led us to this position, only NATO and US provocation. Because again, the issue here is not to give a full picture of the war. The issue is to let Russia off the hook and to hang it all on Washington and the United States. But the reality is, not only are both parties at fault, but Russia is the invader, and we have to treat it in that way. And we have to understand, if we're truly anti war, if we are true to these principles, then we oppose those that are making the war. We don't try to invert reality and make the victim into the aggressor because the victim is associated with a different aggressor. Okay, this is not the nature of anti war politics. It is not anti imperialism, even. Again, if you want to claim that you can't call Russia a sub-imperial power, I would disagree with that. It's not an imperial power to rival the United States, obviously, as we see every day in Ukraine, but it is still a regional sub-imperial power, to borrow Patrick Bond's terminology, and as such, it is engaged in a war of imperial revanchism that is, just as Putin said, to right the wrongs of 100 years ago, as he sees it. There could be no more textbook definition of imperial revanchism than that. Okay, again, think critically about why these voices ignore Putin's own words when he launched this war. There's a reason for it. Okay. One of the other elements that's pointed to consistently and to some degree correctly is the U.S. Ukraine strategic partnership, which is, of course, the strategic partnership that more or less puts Ukraine into the US camp vis a vis NATO. Okay. And the idea here being that because the United States and Ukraine have this strategic partnership, thereby it justifies Russia's fear and or the invasion itself. It justifies Russia's fear that NATO was going to attack Russia, which again, ask yourself, why is it that all of these allegedly anti war voices are simply taking Putin's word for it? Putin is the one making the claim that NATO's expansion is what's driven this war. Putin is the one that's making the claim that Russia's fighting a defensive war. Interesting that their talking points align directly with Putin's. In other words, they agree with Putin, period. There's another. So anyway, the joint U.S. Ukraine strategic partnership, which is also particularly interesting, that they point to that and they point to the documents that more or less led to that agreement. When in fact, as we all know, in 2021, Ukraine had already had 7 years of Russia's quasi occupation of Donetsk and Lugansk. You already had Russia demonstrating to Ukraine over the course of 7 years that they're willing to invade and they're prepared to do so. Why on earth would anybody think that a country like Ukraine, trapped as it is geographically, would do anything other than sign a partnership with NATO, given that reality? Anybody in any similar position would do the same. You could point to any analogy, any question of alliances of small countries to large countries and so forth. Those countries, not only Ukraine, but of course those countries in the Baltic and elsewhere, they look at the two and they see Russia as the greater threat to them because of their history, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the reality. That is the nature of the political chessboard as it exists. But then again, ask yourself, if you're Ukraine and you've been invaded, do you reject NATO? Do you reject the United States? Obviously, the answer is no. No Ukrainian president would have done that at any point since 2014. And in fact, reality bears that out. Both Poroshenko as well as Zelensky himself, both of them have made it very clear that they have no choice. You could disagree with that. That's fine. I would love to hear somebody give an alternative. What would be the Ukrainian alternative to NATO? Giving in to Russia's demands? Ceding territory? Opening the doors? Allowing themselves to be forcibly incorporated into the Russian Federation? I don't know. The point is, there isn't one. I got to keep moving because I don't want to get bogged down in. Okay, Crimea, another one. Here's an example of a phrase that I've heard from several prominent anti-war voices. Several, in fact, they refer to Crimea as quote home to ethnic Russians, a Russian naval port, and a Russian strategic asset. Okay. Crimea was part of Ukraine, as we all know. Crimea was forcibly annexed by the Russians after they militarily occupied very, very quickly in 2014. No country, no country recognizes Russia's claims to Crimea, with the exception of Russia and, you know, a handful of others. I don't have the list in front of me. I think Belarus and maybe a couple of others. Maybe not even Belarus. I don't know. The point is, it is not recognized internationally. It is not recognized even by some of Russia's allies. Okay, so I think the world community understands that Crimea doesn't actually belong to Russia, even though they're doing nothing about it and has basically allowed Russia to incorporate Crimea into the Russian Federation. But ask yourself why an anti war voice on the left gives a damn. What do we care what the international community recognizes or doesn't recognize? We disagree with the very concept of many of these borders, and we disagree with the very notion of an international community led by the United States or any of these other powers. Okay, so what exactly is the left doing in calling Crimea a Russian strategic asset? Well, they are in a very subtle way, attempting to justify Russia's narrative and Russia's talking points. In other words, that Russia had no choice but to take Crimea, that Russia's strategic necessities dictated that it take Crimea, that Crimea is in fact Russian. Why else would you say ethnic Russians? There's three or four different phrases that are very subtly injected into the discourse to convince you Crimea, that's Russian. No, no, in fact, it isn't. Now, I would argue, and I know my Ukrainian friends don't love to hear it, but I would argue that any negotiation is going to involve Crimea, and the idea of Ukraine reconquering Crimea and reincorporating it into Ukraine is far fetched to say the least. So, yeah, Crimea is going to be on the table at whenever a negotiation happens. In my view, I think that's obvious. I think that's clear. And I think the United States is making that fairly obvious. I did a whole video talking about how the Biden administration has been signaling to Zelensky ever since the Zelensky government made the claim that they were marching to Crimea to retake Crimea, that the Biden administration has been leaning on them quietly, urging them to go slow down. Don't talk crazy about Crimea. Because the Biden administration, sadly, much more realistic and much more fact driven than many of these anti war left people claim to be, they're the ones that are saying, yeah, I don't think Ukraine's going to take Crimea back. Okay, so this gets to another issue. The so called anti war left that basically just upholds every one of Putin's talking points while pretending that they don't, these anti war I keep quoting these anti-war leftists, right? They not only do they uphold Putin's talking points, they in fact ignore the reality of what's happening and what's being reported every single day. They present the idea that the United States is just pumping Ukraine full of weapons, more weapons than you could possibly imagine. This is what we have to stop. We have to stop the absolute flood of weapons from the United States and its partners that are going into Ukraine. Inconvenient fact, if you actually read the real journalism that's being done on these issues, that you find that the United States is barely providing enough to keep Ukraine going, just barely. Ukraine begs every single day for more weapons, more advanced weapons. The Biden administration doesn't provide them. Why? Because the Biden administration is rightly concerned of escalation from the Russians. So why does the I keep saying the anti-war left, but they're not really anti-war because they're taking a side in this war. This is what I keep trying to say. It's like they're on Russia's side even while they say that they're not. Because if you read the bullshit that they publish every single week, you're like, it's the Kremlin line. It's the Kremlin narrative, top to bottom. And then, like I said, buried at the very end, they'll say something like, oh, well, of course, Russia's invasion in February of 2022 is illegal, but, and then they give you 12 more paragraphs of why, in fact, it's justified. Illegal, but justified. Criminal, but we support it. We won't admit that we support it because we have our pride, we have our egos, we have our reputations, but secretly we know we support Russia, right? That's what's going on the anti war left, or at least those who claim to be the anti war left. I don't give a damn what they say. I am an anti war voice because I oppose this war. I oppose this war just like I opposed every other war that came before it. NATO was a criminal enterprise in Afghanistan for 20 years, and I opposed it for all 20. The United States and NATO's criminal war in Iraq, I opposed from before the war even began. I opposed all of those wars and I opposed this war, and I've been doing it from day one. Interesting that those who claim to be anti war didn't really emerge with an anti war position until it was clear that Russia was losing badly. Then all of a sudden they found their anti war position. The truth is, their anti war position is a negotiate now and let Russia have a victory position. Right now, they may, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made if one wants to make it that, in fact, that is appropriate, that we should throw Ukraine under the bus in order to prevent global catastrophe or however you want to frame it. Now, I would, of course, debate and argue against that all the way because it's ludicrous, but at least it's logically coherent. But to say you're anti war and to be supporting Russia's war while claiming you're not supporting it, even though you are with every word that you say, that's dishonesty. The Maidan coup. This is another wonderful talking point that really needs to be brought out a little bit. The anti war, or those who claim to be anti war, left, who are calling the 2014 Maidan uprising a coup. Well, this actually gets to another issue that is very, very important, and that is a complete lack of understanding from these same people of what happened in 2014. They just don't know. They don't understand. They don't know the dynamics in Ukraine. They don't know the social movements. They don't know which groups were involved. They don't know the timeline of events, how it happened. I mean, to the extent that they do, the timeline was cobbled together from segments from on RT and elsewhere from people like me who were talking bullshit in 2014, who didn't fully understand what was happening. And I have written and spoken extensively on this issue about that it took several years for me to talk with Ukrainian people, to read about what happened, to read analysis from Ukrainian anarchists and Marxists and others who gave a fuller picture of what happened in 2014. But no, 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 no. All of that is to be ignored. All we need to know is the basic talking point that in 2014 or late 2013 and then into 2014, there was a protest against the pro Russian president. That protest was led by Nazis. The Nazis basically conducted a putsch that overthrew the government and in its place basically put pro US Nazi governments, right? This is the basic narrative that these type of people peddle. Of course, it's not actually true, just like it's not true about the whole taped phone call of Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador at the time, and talking about who they would be picking, to be the prime minister and the president. I mean, that's all mischaracterization. I know because I was involved in that mischaracterization myself back then. I went back and re-listened to the tape. I went back to the context of what the discussion was, etc. Anyway, again, I don't have time to get into all the specifics. The bottom line here is that it was how do I want to put it? I don't believe it's correct to call the situation in early 2014 a coup. I also don't think it's correct to call it just a protest. It was obviously a combination of different factors, but the important point for our purposes now is not to excavate whatever is the objective truth of that situation, but to apply it to today. What does an anti-war leftist in the United States or in the West in 2022, faced with the catastrophe of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what do they have to say about 2014? Well, when they say it was a coup, what they're trying to do, and again, there's a subtle intellectual dishonesty here that you have to pick up on. What they're trying to do is say that everything that comes from that point forward from the Ukrainian side is illegitimate. In other words, the Ukrainians don't have a legitimate government. It's a Nazi government, right? At first, it was Yatsenyuk, and he was the Nazi, and he was connected to the Svoboda people, and was connected to the Trizub people, or the Right Sector, and Parubi, and all of these. I mean, I'm throwing names out there, but these are all people that were part of the picture in 2014, right? So the idea was that the United States handpicks a government of Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, installs them into power, and then turns them against Russia and forces them into a war with Russia. But of course, that's not actually what happened. Ukraine did actually have multiple elections, including electing yet another corrupt oligarch, Petro Poroshenko. Poroshenko prosecutes the war against Russians in the east. Then there is, of course, war fatigue with the corruption of Poroshenko and his gaggle of criminals, and so forth. That then leads us towards 2019, the election of Zelensky, and then everything that comes after that. In other words, a political dynamic that has to be understood, a complex political dynamic with complex parts, or I shouldn't say parts, but complex segments and different moving parts that were all part of a political picture in 2014. None of that is brought out at all. All they say is Maidan coup, US installed the government, end of story. It's not true. Not only is it not true, but it completely ignores any of the nuances, any of the specifics of what happened. Yeah, of course, neo Nazis, right sector, etc., were involved in the Maidan coup. Were they the only ones? Were they the ones that came in the first place, or did they show up to take advantage of a situation? Were they the leading edge? Again, complex social dynamics in a protest. You ever been in a violent protest? I've seen protests turn violent. Things get weird, right? People start running with other people that they would never stand shoulder to shoulder with. If you've been invaded, as Ukrainians have now twice in 8 years, it's going to make for a very interesting political dynamic. But of course, you can't talk about any of that. So, the position that these alleged anti war voices take is not one, well, this is how they say, we're not justifying what Russia's doing. We're just trying to clarify for the left. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Yes, we're all stupid. We don't understand anything. We can't pick up on any subtleties, anything at all. All we need is for somebody in a pink T-shirt or in a baseball hat that says "No War," somebody to just tell us what's going on. Don't justify it. Just clarify it for us. Hey, guess what, motherfuckers? I don't need you to clarify anything. You've clarified enough. You've clarified that you don't actually have an anti-war politics. Your clarification is aimed to liberals, not to the left. This is the point that I want to make here. When you read through most of what they say, the so-called anti-war voices, most of what they say is actually aimed at mainstream liberals. It's not the left. It's mainstream liberals that have delusions about NATO. It's have delusions about the United States. Mainstream liberals are the ones that swallow that stuff. On the left, there is not a lot of that. Instead, what they actually are objecting to is that there are elements on the left that have been consistently opposing Russia's criminal war and that support negotiations. But no, they want to paint everybody that opposes their version of negotiation as being pro-war. Guess what? I'm against any form of negotiation that has as a predicate that Ukraine must cede territory to Russia that it currently occupies. This is a non-starter. No way would any invaded people be convinced to give away territory that they are successfully defending because of the fear that it elicits among others internationally. It makes zero sense. Instead, what we should be talking about is how we genuinely get to the point where we negotiate. I want to make another point here, and I know that this is a point that needs to be made over and over and over and over again because these assholes refuse to engage with the reality in Ukraine. Any government in Ukraine that goes forward with negotiating with the Russians and cedes territory will necessarily be supplanted by a far right government. That is just a basic fact. All of these assholes that have been just screaming top to bottom about Azov Battalion, Svoboda Party, Nazis in Ukraine. Azov is the biggest danger. This is what we need to stop. The Russians are right, and on and on and on. They've been talking for months and months about how worried they are about Ukraine's Nazis. Guess what? The minute Ukraine negotiates territory away to Russia, it will be the far right, the neo Nazis in Ukraine, that will gain power. That is a guarantee. And don't believe anybody who doesn't know shit about Ukraine, who's telling you that an immediate negotiation and an immediate ceasefire is the only way forward. They are lying to you. They are lying to you because it is in their interests to, because they benefit from upholding Russia's talking points and Russia's line. It is sick. It is disgusting. It is, frankly, has no resemblance to anything that is genuinely left, that is genuinely anti war. So, the other issue that they talk about, and this is one where I'm going to have some agreement, is the idea of a military solution. Okay, so they say, well, you see, we have to push back against the idea that there's a military solution to the war. Well, I agree with that actually. I also don't believe that there is a clear military solution to this war. And they also say that the idea of decisive victory, that this is what's being promoted by the media, by the liberal establishment, by the US government, by NATO, etc. Well, there's some truth to that, but there's a lot of falsehood there. The fact of the matter is that if you read the actual reports and analyses that come out, whether it's from the Rand Corporation, from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, from the Institute for the Study of War, or whatever, right? All of these organizations are more or less speaking with the consensus that there isn't a clear military solution here. Right now, these alleged anti-war voices say, no, 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 no. Everybody's saying that Ukraine has to march until total victory. Not even the Biden administration is saying that. In fact, the Biden administration is saying quite the opposite. If you read many of the statements that have come out, well, not only the statements, but the reporting from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and other mainstream publications, the Biden administration doesn't believe there's a military victory, nor do they believe there's a decisive military victory. Now, you could make the argument that the United States wants to simply trap Russia in an endless quagmire, but that's not the argument that's being made here. The argument that's being made is that a military solution is being promoted by the US government and by the US media. I live in the United States. I read the news every single day. I don't see a lot of it. I mean, there's some sentiment, I suppose, and there's certainly some emotional reactions to that effect, but most of the actual analysis that I've read does not actually point to that. So again, it's a straw man argument to say, well, only we, the true anti-war left, only we understand that there is no decisive military victory for Ukraine or for Russia. No, in fact, you're not the only ones to understand that. Plenty of mainstream writers are saying that. Plenty of people writing in foreign affairs and elsewhere with cushy positions at think tanks and so forth are saying the same thing. There's nothing unique, there's nothing original about this position. Okay, so we also, and I mentioned this at the beginning, and I want to reiterate this point. These organizations and individuals that represent these organizations, they almost never, I say almost, even though I can't think of a single example where they are linked up with anti war organizations or anti war individuals inside of Russia or within the Russian expat community, or with any organizations in Europe that are working with Ukrainian refugees, or really any organizations at all, with the exception of the ones that they're always associated with. They're all, signing on to the same, newsletter or the same open letter or whatever, right? But those that are actually involved in a real way in what's going on in the war, whether in Ukraine or in Russia or in some of the other Eastern European countries where there are NGOs operating, where there are left wing organizations, trade unions, other groups that are gathering aid, medical supplies, whether they're making demands of their governments. You see, none of that from the so called anti war left. Instead, what you see is basically just a bunch of Americans and maybe a handful of others from Australia or England or wherever, and that's about it, right? So totally detached and removed from the conflict itself, totally detached and removed from any of the individuals or groups that are directly involved in the conflict, and yet acting as if they can speak on behalf of an anti-war movement to the extent that one even exists. This is yet another falsehood. This is not the voice of the anti war left. This is the voice of the pro Russian left, the part of the left that accepts at face value Russia's talking points, that accepts at face value the idea that the United States is the only criminal regime in the world. Again, I know I'm approaching 40 minutes now, which is way longer than I wanted to do, and I really would get into more specifics, but there's not enough time. Um, I'm going to reiterate a couple of points. Number one, ceding territory through negotiation at this point in the conflict is a guarantee for the rise of a far right fascist government in Ukraine, and a real one, not a Russian manufactured chimera, not a a badly drawn caricature that the Russians peddle on RT or whatever. None of that. An actual, real far right government and or far right forces on the ground. That's what will rise in that scenario. If there is a collapse of the Ukrainian position vis-a-vis the Zelensky government or the armed forces or whatever, it will be reconstituted as an actual Nazi force, right? There are Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Of course, it's not all Russian lies, it's distortions and exaggerations and hyperbole, but there's truth to it, just as I said before. And those are the people that will rise and will have popular support if Ukraine is sold out by its government. And I don't, not that I think that there's much indication that Zelensky is prepared to do that, but if or when that happens, that's what the outcome will be. And you can mark it down and you can write it down that I said on December 19th, 2022, that if we had a negotiated settlement to this war now that cedes Ukrainian territory to Russia, you guarantee the further rise of the far right in Ukraine, and you guarantee a destabilized situation in Europe. The truth is, as I've said countless times, there really is only one path out of this conflict, and that's for a dual track or maybe three-track negotiation process that involves both Russia and Ukraine and the United States and the Europeans in some format, that involves not only the situation on the ground in Ukraine, but that involves other issues, including NATO and others, as Russia has demanded. And most importantly, a negotiation whereby real concessions will have to be made. Unfortunately, this is the reality of the situation we're in now. There can be no good peace coming out of this war. There will be a negotiation if there's going to be peace at all. And that negotiation could potentially involve Crimea and sanctions and a whole host of other factors that all have to be discussed and all been agreed to. But until we get to that point, those who falsely parade themselves as anti war leftists are doing nothing but a disservice to the left and to the anti war movement. They are frauds. They pretend to be anti war while in fact upholding Putin's left. That's all I have for today. I will talk to you all again very soon.